I'm Nancy Ramsay, Director of the Soul Repair Center located at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. I want to welcome you to our webinar series that is co-sponsored by Volunteers of America Shea Moral Injury Center, which is directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, the Senior Vice President for the Volunteers of America and founding director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite in 2012. The center provides resources for religious leaders, hospital and VA chaplains, and civilian caregivers who support veterans affected by moral injury and their families. This series provides information in areas that are under-researched or for which information is not yet publicly available. Today's webinar addresses competencies necessary for readiness in military chaplaincy. 3 military chaplains will respond to a new resource for chaplaincy titled Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care in the 21st Century, an Introduction. It's edited by Wendy Cadge and Shelley Rambo. The book addresses the complexity of spiritual care in a context shaped by multiple intersecting diversities and related social challenges in contemporary life in the United States. The volume includes 27 contributors, reflecting embodying multiple intersecting forms of diversity. The chapter suggests that effective chaplaincy in a context of such diversity calls for persons who bring substantial competencies in meaning-making, interpersonal skills, and organizational competencies. In this webinar, 3 military chaplains, including a contributor to the book, will share the reflections on its contribution to preparing for contemporary military chaplaincy. Our speakers are Zachary Moon, a professor of theology and psychology at Chicago Theological Seminary. Zachary has published widely, including 4 books, Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families, Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injury and Identities in Crisis, and Goat Walking, A Quaker Pastoral Theology, and Doing Theology in Pandemics, Facing Viruses, Violence, and Vitriol. He coordinates partnership development for the Center for Chaplaincy Studies that provides training and consulting to develop courageous and compassionate leaders who can effectively serve in trauma-impacted communities. Prior to his work in graduate theological education, Zachary served as a chaplain in multiple contexts, including the United States Navy Reserve, the Pathway Home, a residential treatment program for combat veterans diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and as a chaplain resident in the VA hospital system. Tracy Allen Barnett is a board-certified chaplain specializing in mental health issues. He helps veterans recover from the trauma of war. He holds a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and a Master of Human Relations from the University of Oklahoma. With over 30 years of ministry experience and 26 years of military service, his experience has taught him that the Holy One continues to speak to us through Scripture, through problems, through people, and in all the small, everyday events of our lives. Trey is the author of 2 devotionals, Whisper in the Morning and Evening Echoes. Nathan White is Associate Dean of the Graduate School of the United States Army Institute for Religious Leadership at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He holds a PhD in Practical Theology, an MDiv, and a BA. An Army chaplain, Nathan currently serves as a reservist at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel for Headquarters, Training and Doctrine Command. He has served in multiple locations and employed to Iraq and Afghanistan. His scholarship integrates theological, philosophical, and social scientific accounts of human experience. He has published with several presses, including Oxford University Press, University of North Carolina Press, and Routledge. He contributed a chapter in Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care in the 21st Century, an Introduction, Facilitating Resilience, Chaplaincy as a Catalyst for Organizational Well-Being. Kyle Fauntleroy, a Director of Development at Brite and former captain in the United States Naval Chaplaincy Corps, will moderate the chat. He's a founding member of the National Advisory Board of the Soul Repair Center. Please direct your questions for our speakers to Kyle through the chat line. Sam McAllister from VOA is our production staff person for this webinar. Please remember that a link to the recording for this webinar will be posted at this website and at the VOA YouTube channel within 2 weeks of today. At the Brite site, you have access to recordings of all previous webinars. After I briefly introduce the book and its background and context, our three presenters will each speak to sections in the book: meaning making, interpersonal competencies, and organizational competencies. By 3 p.m. Eastern, we will invite your questions for the presenters via the chat, and we look forward to learning with you in this webinar. Now I want to turn to a brief introduction to the book itself. Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care in the 21st Century is an important resource for military chaplaincy training and continuing education. It recognizes and responds to the broad religious and spiritual diversity that also shapes the context of military chaplaincy. The book seems to define spirituality as shaped by an individual's way of making meaning for guiding their lives and their ethical commitments for life and community. Such meaning structures may or may not include an experience of transcendence. It attends to the complexity of institutional contexts, including corporate policies and practices for many chaplains, which pose the need for preparation beyond what most initial courses in care and theological schools across the Abrahamic traditions would offer. It also clearly engages the inequities that inevitably distort life in military context, as in every other context in the United States, such as race, gender, sexualities, national origin, language, and economic class. It recognizes and amply illustrates three core competencies that such an extremely spiritually diverse context requires: meaning making, interpersonal competencies, and its third competency also embraces attention to issues related to power that insinuate institutional cultures and practices and the important role of chaplains in knowledgeably addressing such inequities. The editors describe these competencies as organizational competencies, including important ethical commitments for assuring attention to issues of justice related to forms of difference, such as gender, sexuality, race, and class, that are too often treated differently and inequitably. This section gives particular attention to military chaplains' obligations to advise command structures if and when chaplains discern failures of such protection in the context of a base. The book also provides very useful resources for the situations that VA chaplains encounter. With that introduction, I welcome you again and invite your attention to our three speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is Zachary Moon. Dr. Ramsay, thank you for introducing us and welcoming us to the space. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this new volume, which I think through our reflections and our conversations today, certainly the thick value that this book has to offer us at this particular time, I think will certainly be very visible. So I've been charged with speaking to the first section of this book, the one that speaks to competencies regarding meaning making. It's a topic that relates to an important area of our work as chaplains. Certain conditions in life, especially those touched by trauma, loss, and moral injury, can generate crises of meaning. And in such crises, persons may be more likely to seek out chaplain care, especially if they perceive that a chaplain is trustworthy and prepared to support them in that process. In this section, readers will find a rich assortment of case studies provided by a gifted, brilliant group of authors, all of whom are scholars with practical professional experience. However, at least in this section, the case studies themselves, as well as the contributing authors, are not situated in a military context. So if we are bringing that context as the kind of lens or framework to read this book, obviously some translation is necessary in terms of thinking about application for military chaplains. Many of the challenges faced, however, in the case studies are relevant in the military context, including suicide, sexual assault, grief, self-harming behaviors, and complex family dynamics. It's also worth noting here that the contributing authors represent multiple faith traditions, including Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and Protestant Christian, which, from my perspective at least, aids in a kind of broadening of our vision, ultimately, I think, strengthening our effective chaplaincy work to be able to see these issues from that kind of plurality as well. I'm not charged with summarizing the chapters because we want to be encouraging you to get your own hands on a copy of this book and do your own close reading. But I will speak to some of the ideas that are offered in this section and how they can support our work. With the case study material, significant traumas are being addressed in each of these case studies. And while moral injury is not addressed directly, all of these traumas that are addressed here have moral dimensions to them. And I want to highlight a few of those. The central case study focusing on multiple suicides, this is in chapter 3, that take place on a university campus. And describe the work of campus chaplains in responding in the aftermath of these multiple suicides, and really responding to the impact of the traumatic losses that are generating moral anguish. Questions are coming to the surface. Why are young persons, their whole lives in front of them, why are they choosing a final answer to a temporary problem? Who is responsible for these deaths? Are there systemic or structural issues that need to be addressed within this institution that would have changed these outcomes? These are questions faced by the chaplains that you meet in the case study and others impacted, again, in the wake of these traumatic losses. And certainly really bring to the surface, I think, some important opportunities for us to reflect, whether we're working in a military context or in another context, to think about the traumatic losses particular to suicide. The case study in chapter 4 that focuses on self-harming behaviors also brings to the surface similar challenges. The care seeker there is quoted as saying to the chaplain, "I'm not suicidal, but I just want my body to show some evidence of the pain I feel inside." That quote really jumped off the page for me. In the military context, we are deeply familiar with wounds and with wounding. And have seen all kinds of forms of parasuicidal behaviors, cutting and scraping as forms of self-harm. Was an issue that I faced when I served. A member of my unit, their adolescent daughter began cutting, and the unit member's sense of parental responsibility was very activated in a very intense way. I remember them asking questions like, is this my fault? What did I do wrong that my child is hurting herself? The unit member, in this case, was a devoted churchgoer. And so their processing of this particular moral anguish that they were experiencing was very much framed in their faith. And theologies of suffering, issues of punishment, sinfulness, and so on were addressed in our time together. One more case study that I would highlight, this coming in chapter 5, focuses on sexual assault. Obviously not only an important topic in a military context, but in this chapter also the focus is thinking about the ways in which chaplains can contribute by creating meaningful rituals that can respond in the aftermath of traumatic situations, be they sexual assault or otherwise. And the framework to how to structure, how to develop, how to co-create these rituals is really the focus of this chapter, which again, it is so much often the kinds of work that presents itself to chaplains in different contexts, but certainly in a military context. And so some of what's offered in that chapter, again, I think is particularly relevant. With crisis, with trauma that has moral dimensions, it's crucial to engage supportively with moral identity, what in my work I've called moral orienting systems, that I would just quickly define as a system of values, beliefs, and behaviors that are connected through meaningful relationships that really situate or orient a person morally. So when someone is suffering with moral distress or moral injury, there has been stress applied to their moral orienting system, and a breach or a rupture has occurred that demands action. It demands reconciliation, reconnection, reparation. But action needs to be able to be engaged. So the case study material that's featured in these chapters, you're going to see, again, a number of different kinds of crises that have put strain on the subject's moral orienting systems. And again, also really highlighting how chaplains were a part of the process of reconciliation and reparation. In aggregate, I would summarize the authors offering the following guidance for thinking about supporting life-giving meaning-making in the aftermath of moral trauma. And I would just sort of cluster those, again, in aggregate in three ways. The first would be a phase that I would call the receive phase, the kind of receptive phase, highlighting how do we as chaplains show up? How do we provide trustworthy ministry of presence? And how are we supporting spiritual reflection? Again, throughout these chapters, you're going to see some of this terminology used in a shared kind of way between the contributing authors, but all of them highlight the importance of those kind of receptive dimensions in that first phase of chaplain response. The second phase, one of the authors calls a kind of discernment phase, in which we're assessing the needs that are being ventilated, are presenting themselves. How can we identify helpful resources, and then how can we connect and access those resources in support of the care seeker? And then lastly, a third phase, thinking about action, thinking about response. How can we adequately identify what helpful interventions there might be, and structuring those interventions, be they liturgy, ritual, devotional practice, counseling, group processing. There may be any number of forms of what those interventions look like. And then thinking about how to implement those interventions with focus on facilitating connections, and then also thinking reflectively about the effectiveness of those interventions so that we can improve them. And improve the outcomes as well. I'm going to conclude my initial thoughts and notes here. I'm really looking forward to being able to engage with colleagues and with all of you in conversation about this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary. I'm Tracy Barnett. I'm a chaplain here at the VA. I'm not in the military chaplain at this time. But the work that we're doing and the things that we're talking about translates. The information that was shared in this book, it's rich, it's comprehensive. I'm charged with trying to summarize chapters 6 through 8. And the information is so rich, as Zachary was saying earlier. It's filled with some broad thoughts, but they bring them together under some case studies that help you understand the thoughts. I brought some slides with me to help me stay connected to my own thoughts, to make sure I'm following something. Sam was putting it up there for us. This is one of those quotes that caught my attention. It says, people want someone to see their total pain. Who better to hear that than the chaplains? We've got the skills that are able to hear and to advocate and to build bridges, all of those things. And so I agree with Director of Spiritual Care here from the Cleveland area, Amy Green. People want someone to hear their total pain, to see their total pain. We are one of the disciplines in the hospital that's able to slow down long enough to listen with empathy and hear that the total pain of a person. And that provides, as Zachary was just talking about, we can help provide some meaning and source of comfort for that. Next slide. And so this book talks about what chaplaincy should look like in the 21st century as we move forward. We are always developing, always moving forward. Chapter 6 really deals with the chaplain in and of itself, the interpersonal competencies that a chaplain should have. It talks about how we need healthy boundaries. They call it self-differentiation here, providing some boundaries, understanding the power dynamic that a chaplain has versus the patient or the veteran. And because we're so emotionally involved and with the person, it's an emotional, intense situation. And we're caring for the person, we can sometimes lose our balance with that. And so we've got to practice emotional disengagement, regulating our own emotions, learning how to cut off a relationship that is growing to emotional imbalance. The way they do that, they suggested that we have an emotional grid. They call it an emotional gridlock. We need to look at ourselves and check ourselves. We need to have a solid or flexible self that is not dependent on positive reflected self from another. We've got to have that own sense of meaning within ourselves, so we're not caught up in being validated by someone else's opinion of ourselves. A quiet mind, calm heart, using a soothe and calming practice. We ought to have our own practices, maybe self-meditation, those things that will calm our own spirit. That's grounded response, not getting locked into arguments, having a sense of peace about our own sense of values, our own purpose, our own way of responding to people, that we're not overreacting to a situation. And so we can calm our emotions. And meaningful endurance, being able to be in situations that are uncomfortable, but learning how to move through those situations, because at the end of the day, it's going to bring us purpose and meaning. Perseverance is really what they're talking about here. Next slide. They give us 3 of these things that they said we ought to cultivate. The first was that we were just talking about, that those boundary areas. The second area that they will help us to cultivate spiritual trust is learning how to have a sense of spiritual and social empathy, stepping into someone else's shoes, in other words, imagining another's stress, their emotions, and what that might generate from a spiritual or moral orientation, how they're going to respond to that in a spiritual sense. Imagining how a person might live out their values and using that as a coping skill when they're suffering, when they're going through the context of suffering. Can we step into someone else's shoes that's been affected by this intersectionality, intersecting with the social advantages or disadvantages, with things like racism, sexism, social oppression? Can we step into another person's shoes? When we can do that, it builds trust in the others, and we can show a deep sense of empathy. It takes some humility to do that. Not kind of understanding that we don't have all of the answers, and not everyone is built the same. It takes some humility to be able to step into someone else's shoes. Next slide, please. Being reflective, self-reflectivity. Theologian described it as it's a way of discipline, accountability, practicing to decrease our own unconsciousness, understanding that our life narrative and sense of self, and understanding how all those things are fit together in our historical location, where we are right now, our social historical location. It is this interpersonal competency that makes chaplains accountable. We kind of track our own beliefs and our values to search for meaning in this spiritual encounter as we're reflecting on it. It's more than a theological reflection. It's a reflection of who I am at this moment, who I am being at this moment. and how we are tracking our own beliefs and values as we engage with the other person. Next slide, please. Those three things, as they were talking about, looking at the interpersonal competencies, all deal with the chaplain in and of itself, looking at themselves for those things. This next section was really chapter 7, talked about how we build spiritual trust when we engage with another. That interpersonal competency, they say, consists of 3 elements: the knowledge and research of treating spiritual injuries such as suicide, moral injury, addictions. We've got to build up our own knowledge. As we move into the 21st century, it's important that we begin to do some evidence-based research, learning more than the theological bucket that we're in, but we've got to expand more so we can begin to talk and speak in different languages with our mental health partners. Secondly, this world is so connected with by internet that the people that we're counseling, they're already doing their own research on the things that they on their issues, and so if they're doing their research, we've got to do ours too. And so we bring those things to the table so we can talk with them over these things. Third thing is sound clinical wisdom or judgment is important when we are engaging with people, understanding how we can connect with them. If we're going to build trust, they've got to be able to trust us in all situations. Next slide, please. Chaplains can help spiritual care sufferers with PTSD or moral injury. One of the writers summarized it this way. There's 3 things that we can help them do. In my practice here at the VA hospital, working with both groups, PTSD and moral injury, these are the things that we try to do: connect them with God, or their sense of transcendency or goodness, the benevolent other. We can try to identify those things that are embedded, those beliefs that help shape them and how they're impacting them now, or how that they've been injured. And then we kind of co-create a new life-giving belief system or values and what's important to them, help them move towards the things that are important to them. And helping them to build a complex meaning and support system. Who can you depend on? Who can you rely on? Who's supporting you now? All those things we look through, and the chaplain can help a person that's going through some of these life stressors. Next slide, please. Chapter 8 really deals with building our competencies in a system of social justice and what that looks like in spiritual care. Again, these broad topics were helped by the author as they narrowed them down into case studies and what it might look like practically. Sometimes we talk about things through principles, but when you're able to see it in a case study, it makes it more tangible. It makes it more practical. So social justice, the authors argue, is a core facet of spiritual care because of the power dynamics and this and systemic disparities that people are engaged in or happen to have, and so the social justice shows up in the hospital in different ways, or with the person in different ways. This power structure that we are part of, Zach and Nathan are a part of a power structure called the DOD, military. It's a complex network of relationships and procedures. I'm a part of the VA. While I am a chaplain, I'm still part of the VA. And so there are certain boundaries and norms that are spoken and unspoken. And so we have to, as chaplains, figure out how we can navigate this power structure and the power dynamics. Chaplains need to understand the power dynamics and what authority we have. A wonderful case study in the book talks about a person who was at the end of life, happened to be of Jewish faith during the pandemic. The staff did not want anyone to come in, but it was important for the faith, for her son to have the last, to be able to say the last prayers over her. The chaplain was able to insert themselves and negotiate because of the power that the position of power that they were in, to advocate for the family and to talk to the staff to make those things happen. We have to understand that's a power structure. Next slide, please. An example of how social justice or these systems of disparity can take place and impact our community and impact our people that we serve. There was a survey in 2016 of 222 white medical students, residents, that was published in this journal. And unfortunately, they endorsed some of the myths that are going out, continue to be talked about between Blacks and whites. Here's what unfortunately, half of these educated people thought that the nerve endings were less sensitive for Black people. They also endorsed that they felt like Black people felt less pain. They also considered this thought that Black skin was thicker than white skin. When we think about those things, it kind of could sound a little humorous, but it could have some unfortunate results, because providers, if they have these thoughts in mind, these discriminatory thoughts in mind, they may recommend less treatment or inappropriate treatment or not provide medicine. And the outcome could be deadly. Here it is, Black males are 26% higher death rate than white males, and Black females are 19% higher death rate than white females. And so the impact and the power of these physicians who are looking at a particular situation one way can impact people in an inappropriate way and have deadly effects. Next slide, please. Let me end here. When we talk about the dynamics of social justice and spiritual care and what that might look like, the competencies that we need of social justice, spiritual care is the ability for us to contextualize individual care with a wider trend and dynamic that creates different institutional outcomes. That's really what we're looking at. We want everybody to be treated fairly. And so the outcomes need to be different. That takes the humility to watch and learn from different, rather than assuming everyone is the same across the board. I can say more about that later, but I want to end here. But what the system itself needs to be more empathetic, more just, and willing to learn from one another. And I think that's the huge, big impact, that we learn from one another. I think that concludes my brief. I'll turn that over to Nathan.
All right, thank you so much, Tracy and Zachary, and for this opportunity. Glad to be here. Just want to preface my comments just by saying what I say is my own thoughts and may or may not reflect that of the DoD and other organizations I represent, but just want to put that up front. I had the privilege of participating in the writing of this book, and so not to put words in Dr. Kaj, Dr. Rampo's mouths, but I think the idea behind this was to say, if we look at the field of chaplaincy, what is it that needs to take place for someone to be a competent and professional chaplain? And the parts that have been identified already, the meaning-making aspect and the interpersonal aspect are crucial and vital to chaplain competency. But in one sense, those are across the board in different types of pastoral ministry capacities, right? Those are the types of things that are taking place. Part of the uniqueness of chaplaincy itself is that it takes place in an organizational context, right? So for me, chaplaincy is in part chaplaincy because it is ministerial aspects that are taking place in an organization that exists not for the purpose of religious or spiritual ministration, but for an outside purpose. So part of what we've identified, and I think the feedback we've gotten more recently too, is that this last section on organizational competency is in some sense filling a need that hasn't been out there because of the uniqueness of chaplaincy, and in particular, I'll speak here to military chaplaincy because of the particularities of the complexities there. So chaplains, in one sense, inhabit what I call a liminal space. So they're in between two worlds, right? They are religious or spiritual ministers, but they are also within an organizational context. And that is a opportunity as well as a challenge in a lot of sense. So the question is, how do chaplains help the people in their organization and help the people that their organization serves? And I realize that here we may have some who are chaplains or interested in being chaplains, or those who educate chaplains. So I'm kind of putting on the lens here of someone who's both been a chaplain, is a chaplain, and also trains chaplains in the context of how do we get after these organizational competencies. And it's important because chaplains are within an organization, but as my colleagues have already mentioned, these organizations, they may have inherent biases within them. They may, in one sense, perpetuate negative stereotypes or things like that. But on the other hand, they can work for great ends as well. So how do you navigate that as a chaplain? In one sense, I like to say organizations are resilient. They resist change because they have these structures, these cultures within them that are hard to change. They take time, so they're resilient. How does a chaplain navigate that and help the organization become a better place for those who are in it and a better place for those who the organization serves? So how do they essentially leverage their role for good? And that's part of what I'm trying to get after in my chapter, and then also in the rest of the section with my the other authors in this section. So there's a case study or example that is given in particularly within the military context here, and that is of Abu Ghraib. So if you're familiar with that situation in Iraq with a prison there where some of the detainees were abused by US soldiers. And in the aftermath, it was the question of, well, how did this happen, right? If we're supposed to be here, say, liberating or helping, how is it that we're inflicting so much harm, and how did the organization itself become such a place where that could happen? And I don't know all the specifics there, but it seems like the chaplain was sidelined, that in a sense, they were not allowed to participate in that organization to the level that they should have, and that this organizational culture got out of hand. So how do we help that not to happen again? And there's kind of a few steps that I identify as potential possibilities here. One is, first, we have to identify or recognize the organizational dynamics that are at hand. Recognize that there are power structures in play, particularly within the military framework, right? Because you have rank, you have command structure, you have ways of doing things that are embedded in very resilient structures, if I'll put it that way. But how do we identify these frames? That's what the Suyeon Pak in her chapter talks about, different frames that we can use to reference and figure out what's going on within that organization. So once we identify what's going on, maybe what power structures may be at play, what maybe implicit biases there might be, what prejudices or things are going on within the structure, either organizationally or culturally, then we can begin to assess how the chaplain can get after helping to change that, to leverage their position, to leverage the power that they have within that organization, as Tracy said, for good. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that as a chaplain, in my experience. One is through leveraging collaboration across the organization. So with other care partners, interdisciplinary collaboration is huge and a really great opportunity. Essentially looking at across the formation, looking across there at those who should have the same goals as you, wanting to further the mission of the organization, wanting to help those who are part of the organization. So that might be commanders or other people in places of responsibility, and looking at how you can collaborate with them in order to better and strengthen the organization. Because that's the flip side of that organization being resilient, is that once you change it for good, that change is going to be able to stick and to last even longer than just a person and their influence. So if you think about organizations that you might have been a part of where really good things were put into place in the organization, that then outlasts them. And when it becomes a part of the organizational culture or structure, then that actually is helping to facilitate what is good in that organization. And a lot of times that's done through collaboration across the board with other partners. So that's a huge piece of being able to leverage. The other piece, which I would suggest, and this is particularly powerful and unique in the military context, is advisement. So in other chaplaincy contexts like healthcare or the corporate world, there's not as much, in my experience, opportunity for advisement. So within the military context, the chaplain has an open door with the commander. The chaplain has the role as a staff advisor to speak into the commander's decisions and to be able, in that instance, kind of to leverage their power, to leverage their role as a spiritual and religious leader to help that commander make ethical and moral decisions. And in one sense, you could say this is a prophetic voice that the chaplain has in the context of the organization. But part of what I want to highlight there is that the reason that they can have this prophetic voice is because they're already part of the organization. They have organizational capital, if you will. So they understand the organization, they understand how it works. They have developed relationships across the organization, and they become trusted parts of that organization and trusted leaders. And that is the role in which then they can speak into that organization and help advise them and help it to become a better organization. Another piece of advisement, we often think of advising leaders, but it is also advising junior chaplains or other chaplain professionals. And I think that is somewhat unique also to the military context, a little bit in the VA context as well. But because the organizational structure within the military is so well defined and in one sense rigid, there are organizational billets, if you put it that way, for chaplains at all of these different levels. And a part of that is a built-in possibility for mentoring, or at least for advisement of other chaplains, how they can perhaps do their job better, how they can grow into a better professional chaplain and serve the needs of the organization even better. So part of what this book is trying to get after with organizational competencies is that as chaplain care professionals, chaplains in the past have largely focused on being, if I can put it this way, primary care religious support providers, right? Being that person in the room with the individual, providing that care. I think part of what we have to recognize is that the ability even to be in that room is dependent upon organizational structures and organizational dynamics, some of which may be good, some of which may be not as good and may need to be adjustment, but we can be a part of helping to make those changes. But it's a movement beyond just primary care religious support to seeing the chaplain as, in one sense, able to influence systems, influence organizations as a whole. So we have a case study in this organizational care section about a chaplain in a context who counsels with a sexual assault survivor. And in that context, provides that primary care religious support, but then goes beyond that to start to create some support groups, to start to raise visibility with leaders of the organization, and then to create structures of support for individuals like this. And part of what we're trying to get at there is we need that primary care, that one-on-one support. But if we can build structures and influence structures in such a way that there are support for other individuals where perhaps that doesn't happen, or where there are better resources for individuals who have experienced those types of things, then we're actually broadening the good that we can do and making that more durable by linking it to organizations and to those structures that are already inherent within the organization itself. So I'll go ahead and close my comments there because I know we want to have a little bit of time for discussion and for questions. So I think I'll turn it back over to Nancy here.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, all three of you, for these initial presentations. I'm looking forward to rich conversation, and I'm sure that the folks that have been listening will also have their questions to share with us. But let me start by inviting questions that you might have for each other. I certainly have some questions for you, but let me prioritize thoughts or questions that, as you listened, you wanted to pose to one of the other speakers. All right. Well, don't say I didn't offer, because I have. I'll jump in, and then you can add to that. But one of the things that really impressed me about this book, and I can understand the rationale for it, is that it poses extraordinarily high goals, extraordinarily high levels of competency in the areas that each of you name. And I'm aware that each of you has some familiarity with the reality that when persons enter chaplaincies, they come with varied educational levels and often fairly limited experience in practices of care. And then each of the three services, and Trey, I know that in the VA that there's more substantial training given the particular experiences of care that are provided there. But so I'm not as familiar with how that training unfolds. But I'm aware of that there might be 4 weeks, there might be 8 weeks of training before a person is functioning as a chaplain. But the training they bring before that can vary quite a bit in depth and the range of time that a person has. So part of my question, as you can guess, is how to work with the levels of expertise that are proposed, that they rightly name as ideal and in fact really necessary at one level for sure. But how does this function then as kind of horizons for training, maybe in both VA and military chaplaincy? And Nathan, I know since you are actually the dean of the graduate school at the Army, maybe we could start with your response to that and then go with the other two.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. That's a great question, and one that we are wrestling with ourselves. So I would just say off the bat, I think in one sense, a lot of chaplains or a lot of individuals who take seminary degrees do not receive probably adequate training on any of these competencies. In one sense, counseling and that type of thing, but there is a gap that we have seen between the training that individuals receive in theological school and then these competencies that they need actually in the field. So a lot of times we are left providing training to try to bridge that gap. But I would say in all three of these areas, there definitely could be room for improvement in a lot of the theological education that I've seen.
Just to follow up for a moment on that, since you actually have some familiarity with the way education is structured, let's just use the Army illustratively. How do you have you and your colleagues begun to reflect on, maybe using the proposals in this book illustratively, but what the impact might be, how you might go forward with this?
We haven't gotten quite that far, I think, at the moment. We have a limited time span of initial military training to get after some of these things, as well as help people get acclimated to the Army context in particular. What we're moving towards is kind of a life cycle approach that over the course of their career, helping develop products that will help them grow in further competency and professional function. Because we have so little kind of dedicated one-on-one time for that, it's more of a realization that as people progress in their careers, they'll be able to continue to grow in these competencies over time.
I want to come back to your chapter on advisement, but let's let Trey and Zachary jump into the question I posed, and then I also, of course, I want to hear your questions.
Well, as you rightly said, the VA has not a higher standard of education, but to be a VA chaplain, you have to have your seminary degree, of course, your MDiv. You have to be endorsed by your endorsing body. And then you have to have 4 units of CPE. That's a year's worth of training. It's more than 8 weeks. It's a year's worth of training. And some go even more than that and do an additional year of fellowship, depending on the specialty, for palliative care or mental health. And so that's the level of training that the VA kind of requires for the chaplains. It's because the work that we do is it's important. You're engaging with people in their lives, trying to help them get through some difficult pain. And so we all come with our kind of our ecclesiastic training, our denominational training. We understand that. The training for the VA or CPE is to better understand yourself, and it's kind of the things that you're bringing into the room. And so it doesn't interfere with the visit, because the visit is really about the patient or the veteran that's there and their issues. I see someone asking a question about self-differentiation and how not to carry that over. You work through some of all those things with your CPE companions. You kind of battle those things out in the room. And so that you might stay connected in the present with the person who, as they're going through their issues. If it's a difficult visit, like I've had some, where I had to go talk to my chief and say, listen, I just had this visit with this guy, and this problem was really a problem. I need to talk through it and get it off of me. If you haven't done the work, then you might keep that to yourself and be wrestling with those things by yourself. And so it is understanding your boundaries and some of the things that you can do. Let me stop there and let Zachary.
Unmute, Zach.
Yeah, I mean, this is very fortunate, actually, because the three of us are situated really in each of the spheres of this terrain of education and formation for chaplaincy. So I really appreciated getting to hear from my colleagues, Nathan and Tracy, in this regard. You know, my day job these days on the civilian side of life is teaching at a seminary, and the highest enrolled program at our seminary is chaplaincy studies. I mean, this is something that clearly, for those of us who use theistic language, God is doing something right now, and it sounds like calling people to chaplaincy. And so I think the understanding that the theological schools, Nancy said it very diplomatically, talking about, are there some growing edges here in a sort of provisional way? I mean, I would say this book offers us theological educators something more like a clarion call, a demand. Are we really teaching to these competencies adequately and effectively? And I think we just heard from Nathan clearly that, some folks are showing up on the doorstep of commissioning into military chaplaincy and maybe could have used some more formation and some more education in regards to these competencies. And Nathan's a nice guy, so he probably wouldn't say it as sort of harshly as I just did, but I really feel strongly that that the theological schools really are the ones who need to start with this book and start with what the authors have provided to us here, to really think deliberately about whether or not we are teaching for these competencies effectively. And again, not just imagining that it will be enough for CPE, as Tracy was saying, to cover some of this stuff. I think that more or less has been the kind of assumption for a long time is, well, if you're interested in chaplaincy, well, you'll go do a unit or a residency or a fellowship, and you'll sort of get caught up to speed. And I think for many of us, that was true. That was kind of as good as we could get, and we got what we could get. But to me, I think it is very clear that for a number of our schools, we could really do more within the theological school context to get folks ready for CPE, get folks ready for board certification, get folks ready for, as I say, showing up there to work with Nathan in the Army. I mean, I think there's work more probably that we could do there. And again, the question of competencies is a good place for us to start, right? Schools speak learning outcomes, right? We know about, and we have an opportunity, I think, and there's some real clarification, I think, that this particular book offers us in that regard.
I want to jump in there for just a moment, Zachary, simply because the Association for Theological Schools allows graduation in MDiv without a course in pastoral care of any kind. And, there's certainly persons that enter the military then and go into chaplaincy with maybe a 4-week or up to 8-week course at some point soon after entering that, are starting without that competency. And I don't know many theological schools yet that include or require a course for even the Abrahamic traditions to understand, to be competent in knowing, across those three, the postures that they form, each of them. So the competencies that are reflected here exceed even what someone with an MDiv entering the military, which not, with a pastoral care course that is current like that, might have. It's really daunting in the way that I think the three of you have named. That sound right to you? I see Nathan nodding anyway.
Well, and I think all three of us have got stories and experience that might substantiate what I'm about to say. But the work that chaplains do is often life and death kind of work. So when we're talking about some of these gaps and deficits, we should really be appropriately considering what the stakes of this work is really about, right? I mean, you wouldn't want somebody doing surgery on you, who hadn't done all the appropriate education and formation things. There are things that our chaplains face that are just as much life and death stakes as somebody laying you out in the operation room and working on you, and you're just as vulnerable if you're the care seeker. You're laid out and somebody's doing some work, work on you. And I think I think to try to minimize the importance of this, to say, well, maybe we can graduate somebody without taking any classes. I mean, to me, yes, we attention must be paid to some of those gaps and deficits, to be sure.
Before we, there are certainly questions popping up from the audience, which is what we wanted. But let me see, Trey and Nathan, further reflections from you before we open that door, perhaps.
Well, I can say from a personal standpoint, when I graduated seminary, I didn't have CPE. I couldn't spell CPE. I came, there was this certain, I wanted to work in the hospital, and I kept saying, you need CPE to be in a hospital. And I came into the VA and I talked to the CPE educator at that time. His name was Jim Duke. And I said, I want to sit in the back of the room. I just want to know what it is. What is this? And he sent me away, and later to call me and said, if you want to, work here with no pay. And I said, I just want to learn. And so I think, first of all, there has to be a desire to want to learn, want to know what it is. So you can engage a person where they are and not try to bring who you are into the room, all of your beliefs, to get them to conform to some kind of way. You just meet the person where they are and help them in I was talking to someone the other day, and maybe we can't help, but maybe we can hope them. Can I hope you today? And so the chaplain is there to provide hope, give them the strength to move toward the things that they value, that gives them strength and that gives them hope and brings them peace. And so it is learning all those things, those aspects. I'm just completing what we might call the mixed program, which is the mental health and integration with chaplaincy. And so learning evidence-based processes and integrating those into your own theology, and then looking at what another person's theology and then helping them to make meaning and purpose from the things that they're going through. So all of those things, as we talk about, one thing that they mentioned in the book about competencies, sometimes we think that we reach a certain point and we're competent, and they're like, that's not what we're saying here in this book. We're always learning. We're always gaining knowledge. And I think that's a part of who we are as living human beings. We ought to be learning something new every day. And so we ought to be adding something to our bag. We ought to be adding something to our tool belt to help, because our world is changing. The people that we're meeting are different. Less and less people are going to church, but they are what they call spiritual. So how do I meet them where they are? And again, some of what the authors were saying is we had this mindset that we can one size fits all, and that one size came from this patriarchal thinking, and not all of us have that background. And so how do I speak to a person who's come up different, who's had different traumas? All of those things are important, and we just have to be willing to learn, to grow, if not for ourselves.
Excuse me. Nathan, are there things you want to respond to before I begin to turn to some of the questions in the chat? Things you want to reply to this conversation?
Let me just say, so yes, you don't have to have CPE to come into the military chaplaincy, but kind of with that emphasis I mentioned before of helping professionalize those who are already chaplains in the chaplain corps. So we do have a CPE system within the Army where we train in CPE. We also have what we call family life chaplains, who are chaplains that get a master's in marriage and family counseling. So that's kind of in keeping with, after people come to us as military chaplains, then we're trying to better them and give them the skills that they need, because they don't always get those before they come in.
One of the points that I think is particularly well illustrated in that meaning making section is effectively is very skillful listening for the meaning making. I think one way to describe the way this book would describe spirituality is a person's way of making meaning, and it illustrates then in that chapter. The illustrations, I think, are well done in describing excellence in relation to the skills that are espoused in that section or that chapter. And what I was really struck by is the skillful way a person was able to, the chaplain illustrated in the chapter, to connect with and listen for how the individual for whom they were caring illustrated or described the way they made sense of, made meaning of the world. That is, it's a remarkable skill, and a real fluency was, I mean, as you would guess, I don't want to illustrate somebody who did it poorly, but developing the skill for that, and being centered enough in one's own self and way of making meaning would be important in being able to really stay with the person or the family or relational system with which you were working. I am thinking that in the military, where no religious system is espoused, this illustration of listening for the way this person makes meaning, or what meaning system they rely on, is the way in which is what one must enter effectively. And I'm wondering, in your experiences, whether in the VA or the Naval Reserve or the Army, in those in the training for spiritual care, how do those three groups work with this idea of meaning making? As if you were to say that that's a way of entering a person's spiritual world.
I could just speak to it kind of from personal experience. So I wouldn't say the Army doesn't necessarily have like an official position on this, but for myself, entering into that space of a pluralistic environment, really that is the way that I approach pastoral care. Is I get to use like a technical academic term, the phenomenological, right? What is this person, what is their view of the world? How are they trying to make meaning, just as you said? And as I figure that out, then that helps me to have empathy, like Tracy was talking about, but also to understand what their beliefs, what their system is. And that helps me then to know how to better help them and to support them in their meaning making. So for me, that meaning making is really central to the task of pastoral care, and also is a way of entering into pastoral care in a pluralistic environment.
Do others of you want to add on to that from your experiences, Zach?
Yeah, I was just going to say I agree with what Nathan just said. For me, engaging a person, sometimes we do is walking into a room coldly. They don't know I'm coming. And trying to introduce myself. I normally introduce myself as, I'm Chaplain Trey. I'm part of your care team. I'm here because, just like the doctors that just left, we want to care for you. And I asked them, is there anything that they wanted to talk about today? And they normally name the meaning for me. And sometimes there's resistance. And I said, that's fine. We don't have to talk. I just want you to know we can talk about anything from faith to football. As long as your team's not the Cowboys, I'm good. Which normally brings a laugh, like you just did, and breaks the ice. And they say, well, and then they start to talk, even though they just resisted talking. Now they're engaged because I made myself human. And sometimes when we walk in as the chaplain and we walk in as this body of empathy and care, it's something that they haven't seen before. And they resist that until we can make ourselves human and say, you know, I'll walk along with you in this darkness. And I think that's what people will open up and then share their strength, their spirituality.
It strikes me that what you're illustrating in your response, Trey, is one of the points lifted up in the interpersonal skills section of a care provider being sufficiently centered and self-aware that they are emotionally able to manage whatever anxiety might arise, you know, from someone that's in trauma, and help to be present in ways that are calming, supportive. And I think that too points to a remarkable level of training, you know, and self-awareness. But it seems to be illustrating what you're describing in your work at the VA, for example, that you're sufficiently centered that excellent care then allows you to be fully focused on the person or persons who are needing your care. Is that a fair description of what you just summarized?
I think that's a fair description. Again, that's worked out it should be worked out in your clinical pastoral education.
Right.
Reading all those things and what may bother you. I'll give you the perfect example. I walked into a room of an individual who self-declared that he was a white supremacist. And
Was what?
He was a white supremacist. Hey, that was him. That's me. And I said, well, do you want another chaplain? He's like, no, I want to talk to you. And there were some things rising up in me. I got to be honest with you. As he talked about some of the heinous things he had done to people that looked like me. But he hadn't done it to me. And I was trying to be there for him at this moment and trying to find out, well, what is it that you need? And he was renouncing the things that he had done. He wanted to renounce the group, and now he was in trouble. They were after him. He wanted forgiveness, and he wanted to know if God still loved him. Those are the questions that I need to answer. And the reason I could stay in the room with him is because I had worked all those things out within myself. Right. And so the chaplain has to do the work, as they talk about in chapter 6. We've got to do that work.
You know, one of the things that illustrates, and to me, let me just check, maybe particularly with Nathan in terms of the chaplaincy school, the graduate school, but all three of you can think about your levels of training in chaplaincy and this also relates to the final section on organizational skills, because what you've just illustrated, Trey, is real skill in responding to a person who was not only mindful of, but disregarded, attending to your equal worth. And yet in that moment, he was inviting your care. That is to say, you know, in terms of ethically, here's someone who represents complete disregard for another racial group. And in that final section, as you know, in the organizational section, there's really clear embrace of chaplain being a spokesperson for and very attentive to absences of practices of justice organizationally and relationally. And that also takes, I completely embrace that. It also takes real training and self-awareness about forms of difference treated oppressively, so that one recognizes those not only interpersonally, but structurally, as was illustrated in that organizational section. And I'm interested in the three of you who've all had plenty of training in chaplaincy, military chaplaincy as well. What would that mean for training in VA or military chaplaincies? That competency.
I can start to speak to that. I mean, I think just being aware of it, or you bringing it into the room that these dynamics are there, right, and they exist within the organization and within the individuals who inhabit those organizations. I mean, I think I find it interesting, Tracy, if I could just reflect as well, as that this person, I don't know if they sought out the VA because they knew that that's where they might be able to find someone of your background, you know, in the circles that they may run, or the organizations that may be a part of, there may not be that exposure. And so in one sense, the organization itself, by having chaplains there, is creating some of exposure to this diversity that may not exist in broader society in some senses. Yeah, so but in terms of speaking to training and educating, I mean, I think the first step is just bringing into the room that these dynamics are there and are taking place, because a lot of individuals who come into an organization like the military don't necessarily come from backgrounds where they're exposed to different faith groups, or, you know, different cultural and religious backgrounds and other things. So that might be the first step that I would see.
And that's directly related to your chapter on advisement, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, no, definitely. I start to get into it, but Suyon Pak and Lori Garrett Covens, they really go deeper into frames for understanding these different dynamics, and then some of the particular social and political dynamics and other things that may be taking place within those organizations. So yeah, definitely.
Zachary, I know you wanted to jump in on this.
Well, maybe I was making some of the same connection that you just were, Nancy, about that really these three spheres that we've been talking about are really not kind of disparate fields from one another, but are so necessarily connected to each other. And I think about the section that Nathan was speaking to in terms of the how do we navigate these organizations? Well, one of the ways that we navigate it is when it comes home to meaning making, right? If we're working with people in a military context, the culture and the ethos and the practices, the identity formation that are so thick in those contexts, that has to be worked with constructively. That's some of the shared experience that we have working with chaplains and service members. There's a lot of things that are very different about being a military chaplain than serving in the infantry, but one of the things that we do have in common is in that uniform that we wear together, and some of the experiences that we've had in common. So being able to work within the context of the meaning making really that has been engineered as a part of that lived experience. I mean, we've got to work with that constructively. But that would also be true in other contexts as well. I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, Trace, some of what you've talked about in terms of working now in a healthcare context. You know, some of both the crisis and the meaning making work that people are doing is with the experience of coming to be in the context of healthcare, right? I'm here about to get some surgery, or I'm here once a week at the VA to do an outpatient, group that I meet with. You know, these are my people, right? There's so much meaning making that's situated in an organizational context specific way, that part of what we need to be cognizant is not just kind of how do we navigate it, you know, professionally in that kind of sense, but really how it ties into some of the work that we're doing very immediately with care seekers that we're meeting, that we understand the organization and the context as it is influencing the very experience that they're having, some of the questions or crises that are being generated because of it. I mean, most folks don't feel comfortable when they're at the hospital. I mean, the hospital can feel like a very kind of foreign and strange space. So are we prepared, again, sort of being able to recognize or notice that as it is kind of interconnected with other things that may be challenging for them? Some of that, I think, is part of what Nathan and that section of the book really want us to attend to is we need to know not only how do we navigate power within the institution, but how do we recognize the way in which the institution is in and of itself influencing the lived experiences that are happening there.
I'm noticing, Nathan, do you want to reply to that, please?
Sure, and I just was I saw a couple of the questions in the chat. I just wanted to kind of bring in a few of these. I think that there's a question about public theologians and why there's not kind of more of a connection with chaplaincy. And I think it's for this very reason that chaplaincy has been seen more as kind of the individual one-to-one relationship, and so not having as much to do with power structures and that type of thing. But this is getting at a couple of the other questions too, is the idea that how does a chaplain work within the power structures that are within an organization? And that's separating, there's a great question there that separated, what is kind of overt power versus like tacit power. And a lot of what the military is used to is kind of this overt, like the commander told me to do this, but chaplains don't really have that. They more have the influence that they extend through relationship. And I think the first step, going back to my earlier comments, is just realizing the power that chaplains do have within the organization. Once you recognize that and you see the power that you might have, say, to engage with other staff members, to engage with the local community, to engage with the commander, once you recognize that power, then you can then leverage that in ways that influence the system and that influence people within the system. But that's not typically, I think, how chaplains have seen themselves. So I think part of this is just raising awareness that chaplains do have power within the organization and just recognizing where and how that may be.
I think your point is well taken, and that's illustrated in each of the sections. I think about related to this conversation. I'm thinking about the fifth chapter in the book, in the meaning making section. That's meaning making through ritual and public leadership. If there's any organization in the world that relies on ritual, it would be the military. But this is set in a school, as you all may remember. But it was really skillful blending of a chaplain's recognition of the pain that hierarchies, in this case, gender hierarchies, had insinuated themselves in the practices of an institution and were painful to those who were excluded or subjugated, and the development of a ritual service that really, allowed or brought into the room a recognition of the problem, and the illustration of inclusion in a way that that provided an opening for transformation. And I think that's I don't know if any of you want to speak to that quickly. We've got about 5 minutes, but I do think that it showed for the military, where ritual is such an important part of the life of the community, that ritual has, as we all know, immense possibilities for transformation, for ethical awareness and transforming organizations as well as us individually. And this was a chaplain that used that extremely well. That's not meant to be the end. That was meant to be an invitation to you all.
Oh, go ahead, Tracy.
Well, I would just say that in the VA, we have found that rituals are very powerful and necessary. It keeps us together. In one of our groups, we have a ritual toward the end of our 10 weeks together, our moral injury group, where we have this piece of paper that the person writes on some of their suffering, some of their pain, and we have them put it in some water. It dissolves, and those words kind of disappear. Those pains, those thoughts disappear right before their eyes, and you know it's coming because they've seen the person next to them do it, maybe a couple of days ago or earlier that day. But when it's done for them, it's such a powerful event. It moves them to tears that the thing I've been carrying, now I don't have to carry anymore. It's a ritual, but it means something to them. And it's a powerful event.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I just was going to add, not to beat the drum too much, but this is one of the areas of power dynamics that we don't often realize that we have as chaplains, right? Who else in the organization can perform a religious ritual of any kind? Probably no one. But there is so much power in ritual, in being able to perform these kinds of functions, and that's something that we can easily take for granted. But just seeing that we can help influence, we can help bring healing and wholeness to people through things like this, and that we have a unique responsibility and opportunity in the organization to do that.
Zachary, do you have things to add to that?
Well, I'm conscious of our time too, Nancy. So do you want to help to kind of bring us to conclusion?
I think I'm giving you an opportunity to speak before I do that.
Oh, okay. Well, again, it's been such a rich conversation, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface on a number of topics that we've spoken to here. Really just glad for the opportunity to make some of these connections. I would co-sign what my colleagues have just said about ritual and liturgy, to be able to recognize the way in which it involves bodies together in that space, I think is crucially important. It's action taking, right? It's an embodied practice, which often, just as the example that Trace was giving just now, it's a way in which it moves from a sort of talk-based space to an action-oriented space, and I think particularly for military service members, that resonates in a powerful way.
We have we're like 30 seconds now, and I do think that one of the pleas in the chat is, to recognize that there are lots of parallels with the challenges of congregational or particular religious leadership, and then there are the distinctions of a quite hierarchical context in which to work that has its own regulations. But I do think that the three of you in your focus on one of the three parts has, in our conversations, we've been able to lift up the continuities that cut across those parts, but emphasize one or another of the skill sets. I think my sense is that you share with me that this is a very valuable resource, and one that also invites, it's not a quick read in the sense that it is rightly naming the complexity and the remarkable sets of skills. And in that regard, it is the case that effective leadership in a particular faith community, maybe in not quite as dramatic a way on a daily basis, there are real continuities in religious leadership across these spheres, but the organizational structures pose the kinds of challenges that you spoke to, Nathan, particularly in the organizational leadership section. So I do want to thank the three of you for the careful ways that you've brought the value of this text to this conversation. And I know that there'll be, you can look at more of the chat, I suppose, in a moment when we sign off. But thank you very much for helping to lift up the ways in which this invites people into a deeper appreciation for military chaplaincy and VA chaplaincy.